Brew Strong is brought to you by Blickman Engineering, home of the Riptide. Visit them online at blickmanengineering.com.
Brewers, it's time for the beer radio you've been looking for. This is the show that dispels myths, tackles the toughest topics, and makes no apologies for geeking out on beer. Hosted by two guys that drink before they think, Jamil Zainasheff and John Palmer. This is Brew Strong.
Hey, howdy, hey, my brewing brothers and sisters. With me is my good friend, Mitch Steele. How's it going, Mitch?
Going great. Great to be here.
It's good to see you. I enjoyed chatting with you, and it's been a while since we've hung out together.
Yeah, it's been too long.
At least a year or two, I think.
Yeah.
I still need to make it out to Atlanta. Come see you, hang out.
Yes, I'd love to show you some of the great things that are going on in Atlanta beer. It's actually a very underrated beer city. There's a lot of cool stuff happening here.
You've spent a lot of time on the West Coast, a lot of time and a number of years there in Georgia now, and you're from the East Coast previously. What would you say is the difference between the two beer scenes, East and West?
Yeah, it's hard to generalize, but I will say that when I left San Diego, everything was obviously very IPA focused, and West Coast IPAs were everywhere. Hazy's really hadn't started making inroads, in 2016 when I stopped brewing in San Diego. I think when I first got to Georgia, my impression was that they were the beer drinkers in the Atlanta area appreciated styles, classic styles a bit more than where the West Coast went.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of Pilsners here, some just kind of old school craft styles that were still hanging on.
Mm-hmm.
There was not a lot of IPAs. There's one that is selling like gangbusters in Atlanta, and that's called Tropicalia. It's brewed by Creature Comforts, and that beer was one of those beers that was succeeding because of, number one, it's a great beer, but number two, it was rare for years. They couldn't make enough of it, and so when a load dropped at a beer store, people would line up and they'd be sold out in a few hours. But I think in general, my perception was that things like pale ales and dark beers and Belgian styles would go over better in Atlanta than they would have at that time in San Diego. Mm-hmm. And I think the Atlanta market has evolved. And really what I'm seeing now is and I'm seeing this everywhere in the country, but in Atlanta, it's definitely a real thing, is that everybody's brewing lagers. Mm-hmm. And, I think there were 28 breweries that brewed Oktoberfest beers in the Atlanta metro area this year. Mm-hmm. I mean, think 5 years ago, you might have had one or two breweries that were doing it. And I think, and I was out in the Pacific Northwest for hop selection, and I was in Colorado for judging Great American Beer Festival, and I saw the same thing. And, and granted in Denver, some of the great craft beer bars aren't there anymore, but all the brewers were posting pictures of being at Bierstadt and having that slow pour pills and which is a beautiful beer. And it's funny, I was in a really good beer pub close to my home recently, and they had that beer on tap. They brought it in from Colorado, and it was really cool. So I think there's a brewery here in Atlanta called Halfway Crooks that does all lagers, and they're killing it. People are really, really in love with that brewery, and they're great people, and they make great beer. And there's a couple of other breweries, Round Trip that does a lot of lagers as well. And every brewery, I mean, we do a lot of lagers. That's been kind of a nice thing for me, because, obviously I brewed a lot of lagers at Anheuser-Busch, but it was all the same kind of lager, right? Mm-hmm. It was all variations of the American lager. And now I'm, one of our best selling beers is a German Pilsner. We're doing a Munich Dunkel that's on tap in all of our restaurants all the time. It's been fun, and we still brew IPAs, and I still like brewing IPAs, but
I think the difference, and I've noticed a similar difference, or noticed the same myself. East Coast, there's more of those other more classic styles, and West Coast is pretty much all IPAs. But what I attribute it to is the proximity of the East Coast to Europe. Yeah. And how easy it is to go from the East Coast to Europe and visit and experience all those beers, and vice versa. And then on the West Coast, the proximity to the hop growing regions and the influence that has.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. And I will tell you that when we took over the brewery in Virginia Beach and opened up the tap room, Virginia Beach is a very heavy military town, right? It's been built on the military, and there's bases all over the place there. And, we'd get veterans or soldiers coming in and having beer at our place, and they love the German beers because a lot of them were stationed over there and were drinking those classic styles. And they're like, oh man, it tastes like I'm back in Germany, and I mean, I can't think of a higher compliment for one of our beers, than that. And, it's been cool. It's been really, really neat to see.
Who also is really neat to see? It's our good friend, John Blickman. He's out in Indiana. That's where they do their magic, all the creativity, the thinking, the crafting of things to make your brew day better, from the smallest homebrew setup to the most elaborate commercial system. They've got everything in between. So check them out. If you're serious about your home brewing, check them out. If you're wanting to start up a brewery, they can get you out there too. Good guys. They've been paying for the show for 15, 16 years. So the least you could do is send them a nice email. feedback@blickmanengineering.com. Tell John Blickman thank you for providing these wonderful shows for the last 15, 16 years. Today, we are going to do some Q&A. We take questions at brewstrong@thebrewingnetwork.com. You can send your questions in there. We won't answer them in the email, but we will answer them on air as we get to them. And we really appreciate them. If you're listening live, you can also ask questions in the live chat. Go to the Brewing Network page on Facebook, go to the video there, and just enter your comments in the live chat. That'll do it for you. Let's see here. First question is from Mike. He says, first, I understand this may be a dumb question. Mike, there's no dumb questions. There's just dumb people. So don't worry about that. When milling grain in my garage mill setup, the milled grain goes through a PVC pipe into a bucket. A considerable amount of static electricity is produced as the grain flows through the PVC. Could this affect the beer in any way, specifically thinking of the effectiveness of finings in the finished beer? I've noticed gelatin hasn't been as reliable of a fining agent for me in the last couple of years. I'm too embarrassed to ask this question to anyone in person. LOL. Mike. Yeah, Mike, great question. I've never heard this question before, but my take on it is it's a non-issue, because that grain, if anything, perhaps it's a slight issue as you're doughing in, maybe, because the grains want to kind of cling together or cling to things, and maybe that could produce a little bit more dough balls. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm hunting for some effect other than, but once it goes through the mash and it's boiled, the static electricity is gone. The static electricity is fairly minor anyways. I don't think you should have a problem. If you're really concerned about it, you might be able to ground your PVC pipe or replace it with something else, like a piece of copper or something. And the the static electricity should be minimal or go away at that point. You got any thoughts on this, Mitch?
Yeah, my first thought on hearing this question was that as soon as you add water to the milled grain, all that pent up electricity energy is going to go away.
Yeah.
And so I'm with you. I think once you go through the mashing process, and then as you go through the brew house, it's not going to carry through. And yeah, grounding, is always a good thing. When you're, I think that's a bigger concern, is that, if Mike is a smoker, that would be a problem, right?
Well, and that, yeah, static electricity could discharge, get a spark. The thing about grain dust explosions is you need to have an enclosure in order to build up pressure for there actually be an explosion. If the ends of the pipe are open, you're not going to get an explosion.
Right.
You have to have a certain density of dust, and it's really thick. It's so thick you wouldn't be able to see your hand, holding it like a foot away from you. And then you need to have enough heat to cause the explosion. So I wouldn't even think that that's an issue. So, I think you're fine.
Yeah.
You can ground it. It certainly wouldn't hurt to ground your PVC pipe or replace it with copper or something. There you go. Good question. All right, let's take a short break. When we come back, we'll have more of your questions right after this.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
Are you looking for a simple brewing system that's great for all grain brewing, but everything on the market seems to be full of compromises? Blickman Engineering has the answer. The Blickman Brew Easy All Grain Brewing System. The Brew Easy is a complete system with easy upgrades and a beautiful compact design, perfect for any size brewing location. At its core, the Brew Easy is built on two gorgeous Blickman Boilermaker brew kettles, a high-temperature March pump, and either a top-tier gas burner or the new Boil Coil electric heater. The Brew Easy adapter lid allows the pots to stack on top of each other, forming an efficient, strong, and compact brewing setup that comes in 5, 10, and 20-gallon batch sizes. Upgrade your Brew Easy system with full automated control by adding a Blickman Tower of Power temp controller, and make moving around easy with the Blickman Kettle Cart. The Brew Easy is modular. If you already own a Boilermaker kettle, you can build your Brew Easy by purchasing just the modules you need. The new Brew Easy all-grain brewing system. See it today at BlickmanEngineering.com and brew with Blickman quality on your new Brew Easy.
Learning to brew has never been so disgusting. This is Brew Strong.
All right, we're back. I'm here with my good buddy Mitch Steele. We're doing live Q&A. If you have your questions, you're listening live, you can type them into the live chat there on Facebook on the Brewing Network page. I can actually see those. Tom writes, "Hey guys, thanks for doing this show. It has been very helpful in my home brewing adventure. I've seen Fermentus has the new E2U yeast procedure, which I believe stands for easy to use yeast procedure. I rehydrate my yeast, so I'm a little skeptical. Is there some kind of new addition to this yeast for non-rehydration, or is this just a selling point? Thanks, Tom." What do you think, Mitch?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. From my point of view and my experience, the evolution of dry yeast has been huge over the last several years. And so the quality is at a much higher level than it ever used to be. Mm-hmm. Even on a commercial level, we can add yeast dry to a fermenter and it'll start working right away. I don't think there's any harm in continuing to rehydrate this yeast. And I actually, I had to look up what E2U was, but it's basically just a dried yeast that they're recommending or saying you don't have to hydrate at all. So I think you could do it both ways without any ill effect. But I think, at this point, a company like Fermentis, I know several people who work for Fermentis. I know what kind of company it is. They do their research. So I don't think they're putting something out there that is just a marketing gimmick. I think they've done some work, and I don't know what they're doing on this yeast. If they're who knows what they're doing in the drying process or whatever. But I would expect that it delivers as advertised.
Yeah, I would think so as well. The whole thing I was going to say, but I'm getting too old. The interesting thing on it is, I think they're some of the yeast they say are not the E2U variety, because the powderiness of the yeast needs to be right for it, I guess. And maybe some strains don't powder up right, or they're too powdery. If it's too powdery, there could be an inhalation danger, I guess, while you're pitching it. Or I think they mentioned something about, certain yeast with enzymes. You don't want to do this. You need to be careful. At least wear some sort of protection if you're going to do it. And I guess the dispersal of the yeast across the liquid layer needs to be amenable to that. So it's got to be powdery enough so it spreads out. It doesn't just lay there as clumps or whatever. And like you're saying, very smart people done a lot of research. I'm sure that what they're saying is true. The difference in dry yeast now to when we started doing this show is dramatic. They've made a lot of dramatic increases. So I think, you're probably okay if they're specifying a yeast as, pitchable as is. I think you do fine. I think you do fine to rehydrate it as well. I don't think there's any danger to rehydrating yeast. I think in the past, there was some, it's like, oh, no, don't rehydrate it because you're, and yet they were still telling the commercial brewers to rehydrate it, which that kind of rubbed me wrong. I think that there was, a mixed message going on. But today, I think they've made the changes, and I think maybe the yeast is good to go. Good question, Tom. Kim writes, it is my understanding that you are able to get about 8 parts per million of oxygen into wort using air, which should be okay for lower gravity ales. But if you brew higher gravity ales or lagers, you may want approximately 12 parts per million of oxygen. I've also heard it mentioned that yeast consumes most of the oxygen available in wort in a couple of hours. So my question is, if you are using air, like an air pump, for example, are you able to compensate for the lower starting concentration of oxygen by re-aerating the wort 1 hour after pitching the yeast, for example? Does the yeast get enough oxygen for high gravity ales or lagers this way? Or is there some benefit in having a higher concentration of oxygen when pitching the yeast? That's quite a good question, don't you think?
Yep.
What do you think, Mitch?
So first off, if you're using air, the maximum dissolved oxygen you can get in your wort is about 12 parts per million. If you're using pure oxygen, then you can get much higher, and it's actually quite possible to over-oxygenate and really stress out your yeast, which can result in off flavors like acetaldehyde and stalled fermentations and things like that. So you got to be careful with oxygenation. I think the question is a really interesting one, and certainly there are brewers out there that will add more oxygen after lag period and but before the fermentation really gets going. Our rule at New Realm is if the gravity's dropped more than a degree Plato from its original gravity, we typically don't oxygenate brews going into that fermenter anymore, because the yeast is already acclimated to having no oxygen. And if the yeast bounces back and forth between having oxygen and not having oxygen, you're not going to get the same fermentation consistency as if you didn't do that. That being said, if this question is framed in a way that it's early in the process, and so if you're brewing a high gravity beer and you want to get more oxygen in it, I think theoretically this could work. You just have to know when to stop doing it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I always, when I'm doing something, like over 20p, I will do a second dose of oxygen, 8 to 12 hours in. And generally it depends. I mean, sometimes, earlier than that, it's before the beer really kicks off and before gravity is dropped, like you say, more than a certain amount. But I find that that's really important to fully attenuate those big beers. And then when we do something like we did whale juice, which was 18.5% IPA, it's a sessionable 18.5%. You're adding oxygen, multiple times, during fermentation. It's the only way you can drive that down. You don't seem to get any, real, negatives or, huge negatives from that, especially in a beer that big, much better than it being really sweet. So there's that. And then there's also, I take from, British brewing, and in British brewing, aerating your beer, 24 hours in is a common thing. Mm-hmm. They do the double drop. They Burton Unions, and they were trying to get air into the beer, and it's because the yeast really needed it. A lot of low attenuating yeast, and the flavor is of course different once you do this, and you get more ester production, and it's just part of the style. And so even that's possible. I think this is an interesting question, because even if you're doing air and you're doing an ale, for example, the Imperial Juice yeast, they recommend using a high dose of oxygen, 20 parts per million, in your wort for that. If you're using that yeast as a home brewer, I could see hitting it, a second time, because with air, because I don't think you're getting enough with air on a yeast like that. So it's going to be yeast dependent. Some yeasts, won't be an issue. Some yeasts, I think definitely you're going to need more oxygen or more air. So a good question. I think his technique is sound. If he doesn't have access to oxygen, I'd pursue that. Kim, I'd go down that road. I think it's a good idea.
Yeah. And just to reiterate your point, I think it is very strain dependent. Certainly, when I've changed breweries, I've had to kind of relearn oxygenation parameters for the yeast that we're using. It's a really important thing. So, keep that in mind as well.
Adam asks in the live chat that you can go on the Facebook page for the Brewing Network and ask your questions live. Adam asks, so here's a controversial one for the masters. How do you feel about the state of hype beers? They're now going for upwards of $100 for smaller format bottles, 375 to 500 mil, or cans, 12 to 16 ounce, directly at breweries, or even higher in the secondary markets, aka the black market. Is this the elevating beer to wine status that some were championing back in the early days of craft beer wanted, or did that go too far? Recent example is Anchorage's A Deal with the Devil that was just released for a single 375 at the brewery for $70 and sold out in minutes. On Tavour, going for $100 plus shipping with a 2-bottle max. And who knows what he'll be going for in the secondary hyper beer zombie circles. Yeah, I think sold at the brewery. you know, if the brewery is able to make money off of it, and they need it to survive, you know, more power to them. I was always, it's like, well, fair price for a fair product. So we never really got into the hype pricing. But yeah, the secondary market, I don't know. It's just weird to me. People buy and trade these beers and never drink them. You know, they just, it's like collector's items. And it's like, well, what I get from beer is the experience of drinking it and sharing it with friends, and then the memories and, you know, the sensory and all that stuff. So for me, I don't know. What's your take on it, Mitch?
Well, I think I kind of land in the same place you do. I didn't realize this was still going on like it is. You know,
it's getting worse.
It's getting worse. So that shows you how out of touch I am. But I'm with you. I think charging a fair price for the beer based on ingredients, based on the labor that's used to make the beer is a longer term business model that I think really works. You know, for these breweries that have created these hype beers and they get the long lines, more power to them. You know, I think they've struck gold in some ways. And I don't know how they did it. But you know, sometimes that's something you need as a business to ride out and experience to its fullest. But, you know, from my point of view, I don't seek beers like that out. If I get to try one, great. But I'd rather just go down to a pub and get a glass of IPA or get a glass of Pilsner and enjoy it, you know, and like you said, the experience is all about it. You know, beer trading, you know, I've sent beers, you know, to friends and things like that, but I've never really gotten involved in beer trading like a lot of people have. And I get it. You know, if you're looking, you know, you want to bring in, you're in New England and you want to bring in this super rare beer from San Diego. Okay. Yeah. I get it, you know,
but then drink it, for God's sakes,
drink it. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. And, you know, the beer business continues to confuse me. You know, who knows what's going to happen
as it confuses us all. All right, let's take another short break. And when we come back, we'll have more of your questions right after this.
Back to the two guys that know how to turn beer into beer. This is Brew Strong.
All right, we're back. We're here live with my good friend Mitch Steele. We're answering some of your questions from the submissions to the Brew Strong at thebrewingnetwork.com. I knew I'd get it right eventually. And also from your live chat. Adam's been quite active. He's got another question is, what are your favorite techniques for dry hopping right now to get the most aroma and flavor out of your IPAs? I'll tell you, for me, it was wait till fermentation's over, yeast have settled, harvest the yeast, add the hops, and then recirculate. We would recirculate for about 3 hours, and then let the hops drop, get them out of there, and centrifuge and package. The recirculation just made a world of difference.
Yeah, we bubble CO2 up through the bottom of our fermenters to try and resuspend the yeast. And we do that 3 times before we allow the yeast to settle in the cone and then chill the tank. And I'm with you. I still think a post-fermentation hop addition is money. You know, that's where you get, if you're looking for classic hop character or really how the hop expresses itself in a beer, to me, that's when you would add it. If you add it later on when the beer's cooler or chilled, you're not going to pull as much material out of the hop. And if you add it earlier, then you're going to get biotransformation and some other things going on that you may want, and that's fine. But if you just want pure hop, that's when I dry hop.
And agitation, I think, really maximizes your yield off of your hops. Gets the most into the liquid. Jim asks, Jamil, looking at your great pics of pubs in the UK on Facebook, I was wondering if you think it would be possible to recreate the great British pub or brewery feel here in the US. What would be missing? Well, this is interesting because a buddy of mine, Matt Thomas, he built a little British pub in his garage. He had a tandem garage, and I was helping him remove old water heater, and we were going to put in an instant hot water heater. I said, well, put the instant hot water heater outside, and then you freed up all this space. I said, and then turn this into a British pub. Most people would be like, not him. Within minutes, he's thinking that way. And by the next day, he's like putting up walls and building this thing. And he's got, the wallpaper and the tin ceiling and it's beautiful. It is a British pub. And I will go over to his house sometimes, and we'll go and we'll sit out in the pub, and it's just like, hanging out with friends at the pub, or, yet it's still missing something, that British pub experience. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that I think here, we're just a bunch of Americans in a pub, and the experience is a little different. Whereas in England, you go to the pub and just the other people, I talk to people I've never met before in a pub in England, and it's just the most wonderful experience. You just start, joking around a little bit, and everybody freely gives it back to you, and there's no offense taken, and it's just fun. Here in the US, you got to be a little more careful about that, I think. I don't think so. I think the British pub experience is the British people. I think that's really what which makes it something unique in the world.
Yeah, I agree. I think, the people that you interact with in the pub is a critical part of the experience. And I was going to mention that the bar I was talking about earlier that was pouring the Bierstadt lager, they recently built a British pub in a corner of their building. And this is a really neat place. And they did it really authentically, wallpaper, pictures of English royalty, and, a painting of Michael Jackson, the beer writer, on the wall. And they've got 4 beer engines. And, when we started New Realm back in 2017, 2018, I had big ideas of having a cask section and trying to build a British pub in one of our event rooms. And it didn't work out for a whole lot of reasons, and we ended up not doing it. But now I can drive 10 minutes and get to what I consider to be the closest replication to a British pub that I've experienced in the Atlanta area. And it's really done well. I mean, they treat their beers well. They always have Sierra Nevada ale on cask. And then they bring in local brewers as well. And there are some brewers in the Atlanta area that are doing a great job replicating, bitters and other British beer styles that, you typically don't find anywhere. And, and you go into that place, it's very cozy, right? It probably has 8 seats in there. So you're always sitting next to somebody. And so the conversations just happen naturally. And that's pretty close. It's not the real deal. And I think just sitting in a room with British or Scottish people and having a beer and listening to the conversations with the dialects and the accents is a big part of it.
Right. Yeah. Built this British pub, my friend. And so I started homebrewing again. I started producing real ale, great British bitters and stuff. And I've been, filling pins for them. Yeah. Take it over there and invite everybody over. And just a few of us will kill that in a couple of hours. And it's just fantastic. I mean, I'm killing it on brewing some of these beers. I know you'd be impressed.
Oh, I would love to try them. I think, a big factor in this is the low alcohol of the beers in those British pubs too.
Right.
That just leads to being able to hang out longer and having good conversations and and I think that's an element that I'm starting to see creep back into American beer culture, kind of lower alcohol sessionable beers. But in England, that's the normal. I mean, if you get a beer over 5%, you're drinking strong beer in England.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So.
Well, and that's happening more and more with the new breweries that are starting up, and everybody's brewing West Coast IPA or hazies, or and it's all 6-7%.
I remember back
you're killing England for me.
Back in 2009, we went, Steve Wagner from Stone and I went over and brewed an IPA, and it was 7%. And I went back with Greg Cook for the release party that was at a Wetherspoons pub in London, a beautiful, refurbished bank building that had been turned into this huge pub. And there were a lot of English brewers there that had participated in this program, in this event. And there were so many of them that wouldn't even try the beer because it was too high in alcohol.
Yeah, they're just like, oh no.
Yeah, they're like, I'm not going to drink that. I'm like, you're not even going to, like a 1 ounce pour. You don't even want to try it. Oh, no. I'm driving. Or
right. Not the case today.
Yeah.
I was in Edinburgh in 2000 or so, and I was at a pub, and they had Old Peculiar on. I'm like, and it was tasting fantastic. I'm drinking pints of that, and I'm hanging out with these other guys. They're drinking something around, high 2s, low 3s. And we're pint for pinting on this. And they are they're like, oh my God, how can you even drink that? It's 5%, it's 5.2 or whatever it was, 5.4. I'm like, I'm from California. This is session ale for us.
That's funny because, when we originally proposed that first beer to brew for the Wetherspoons chain, we wanted to brew a double IPA, and they said no. And so we compromised. We weren't going to do anything that wasn't stoned, right? So it was going to be a 7% beer. But Steve proposed the name California Mild. Which if you've ever met Steve Wagner, he's got a great sense of humor. He's very funny in kind of a droll, quiet way, and I that just made me bust out laughing. And
yep, that rings true. Let me tell you quickly about my good friends up near Reno, Brew Chatter. It's a great homebrew shop, lots of fresh ingredients, everything you need. They even have distilling equipment in there if you're into distilling or want to learn to distill. Lots of knowledge. These two guys know a lot about brewing and a lot about customer service. Go check them out. Great folks in there. If you stop in, tell them hi from me. Just say Jamil sent you. They'll know who I am. Good folks. I'll be up there in November, and then Mitch is coming someday, and we'll all go.
Yes, someday.
We'll go check them out. John asks in the chat where you can ask questions if you're listening live. John asks, Jamil, I remember you said one of your biggest things you can't live without as a pro brewer is zinc. I brew 10 gallons at a time and usually north of 1050. So reusing yeast and or building it from starter is almost always necessary. When is the correct time to add nutrient, and what nutrient should I use? So the correct time to add nutrient is there's, when it comes to like yeast additions, zinc additions and stuff, there's people who actually add them to the fermenter, because if you add them during the boil, a lot of the zinc will get trapped up in the trube.
Yeah.
And it'll cut about half of your zinc addition out. But then zinc is cheap. And then the reason that I never add it to the fermenter is because it's a powdered product. And the process of making powders generally involves blowing a lot of air. And so a lot of times they're not necessarily going to be flawlessly clean. There could be bacteria or wild yeast in there just from that process. So powdered things, generally you gotta look out about adding those to the cold side. So for me personally, I would add them to the hot side. You can add it towards the end of the boil. Last 10 minutes is fine, 15 minutes. And as far as the correct nutrient to use, I would use something that does contain zinc, especially if you're repitching. You can also just get some zinc supplements and add some of that, or you can maybe find a local brewer that's willing to give you a little bit of zinc. The thing not to use is something with a lot of fan, because if you put too much fan in, unless you're doing something with a lot of adjuncts, if you're doing something like a mead or something, the fan is very useful. But if you add it to most barley-based, grain-based brews have plenty of free amino nitrogen. And so if you add too much, it can really accelerate the fermentation and can end up in something that gets very hot and does not taste too great. So be careful there. To follow up, do you need to add anything to the starter? You can. It certainly doesn't hurt. Just don't overdo it because in too high concentration, the zinc and the other materials in the nutrients can be harmful to the yeast. I used to use Servomyces to my starters. And actually what I would do is can starter wort. I would add my nutrients to I'd add DME, nutrients, water, and then put it in the pressure cooker, and then I'd sterile wort with all the nutrients needed. So, you got anything to add to that?
No, I agree with everything that you just said. Most of the commercial yeast nutrients that are out there and available do have a significant amount of zinc in them. So, those are tried and true. I think it's, safer to add it at the end of the boil. You are going to lose some of it, but like you said, it's not that expensive. And, but it's a pretty valuable thing to add, especially if you're doing high gravity beers. I'll tell you, there was a time at Anheuser-Busch, and I don't know if they're still doing this or not, but yeast settling in Anheuser-Busch lagering process was controlled by zinc additions in the brew house, because zinc, the more zinc you have in the wort and in the resulting beer, it enhances yeast flocculation. And so one of the things that we monitored every day was cell counts at 10 days in lagering. And if they were starting to trend high, we would add more zinc. If they were starting to trend low, we would decrease the zinc. And that had a huge impact on the yeast health and just the conditioning process that was happening in those lager tanks.
Right. Well, and you could certainly, boil some zinc or make yourself up a jar of, sterile zinc water or whatever, nutrient water, and add that to the fermenter. That'd be another way to go. It's just the extra effort. It wasn't worth, the juice ain't worth the squeeze, as they say. So yeah, there you go. Ron, I think, he says he brewed a Belgian ale, 12 gallons, screwed up on the recipe. Recipe asked for 4 ounces of special B. I put in 4 pounds. The rest of the recipe is 14 pounds Pilsner, 2 pounds Vienna, 1 pound wheat, and Y yeast 1214, 3 pounds of sugar. Any thoughts on how I can make it drinkable? Haven't tasted it yet. 3 days in the fermenter. Maybe blend it with a pale ale, dilute with water. My thoughts are it's going to taste like a caramel candy bar. Lots of hops, noble and American. Maybe dry hop with a bunch of Citra. And thank you for making me a better brewer. I do all my shopping with your sponsors. Well, that's very kind of you. I would taste it first. You're talking about what, 20%?
Yeah, 20% special B.
Yeah, it'd be all right. Special B, it does have kind of a figgy, caramelly thing to it, but also surprising amount of almost roast flavor. kind of balances, adds kind of a dryness to it. I would taste it first and see. Yeah, you never know. You'd be surprised. And that would also inform you as to what kind of change you wanted to make on it. Whether, and you could, certainly try diluting it in the glass and see if that helps. I don't know. I kind of doubt it. I mean, it may thin it out, but
yeah,
it's going to thin out everything. Blending it, the traditional way that a commercial brewer would do it is to brew another batch, using probably just all the other ingredients except Special B. And it would be, 10 times the size of this batch or whatever it would be. And then you would, blend it in there, little by little. Whatever other beer they were brewing, as they're brewing this, they would leave out the Special B and just dose a little bit of this into their regular batches until it was all gone. I don't know. That, or you just chalk it up to a loss.
Yeah, I'd try it. I mean, the famous story about Arrogant Bastard Ale was that Steve, when he was homebrewing the test batch, did a mistake, something like this, where he added too much of one malt and he was going to dump it. And then Greg tasted it and said, "Why would you dump this? This is the best beer I've ever tasted in my life." And then boom, they had Arrogant Bastard. So happy accidents in the brewing world can sometimes result in something really wonderful. And so I would taste this before you make the call on what to do with it. I think blending with a lighter beer might help. I'm not sure about the dry hopping because it looks like you used Belgian yeast in this. And I'm not sure if that would, all those flavors going on would work well together, but you can try it. It's
Right. And Mitch isn't saying it, but I'm saying Arrogant Bastard has a whole ton of Special B in it. Special B and Chinook.
Yeah, I still can't comment.
Yes, I know. No, but we cloned it. That's fine. You go back to Can You Brew It and just check it out. Just check it. Sean asks, "Gentlemen, I know that the CO2 produced during fermentation is harmful to yeast, and you want it to make its way out of the beer and out of the airlock. I also know that to ensure good attenuation, some brewers rouse the yeast by rocking the carboy. I was thinking, what about having a stir plate under the carboy with a stir bar set at relatively low RPM in the beer to keep the yeast suspended and help drive out CO2? Once the beer has experienced terminal gravity, you just turn it off. Am I onto something, or am I just a dipstick? Thanks for all the years of great information, Sean." I've heard this, multiple times before. I would not do this. If what your goal is to get quick attenuation and maximum attenuation in a ferment, then certainly this would work and this would help. But it's, what you're trying to produce is a flavor that has been produced for, many thousands of years. And there's certain expected flavors. If you remove the CO2, you'll get more esters. You'll get a different character to the beer than perhaps is desired. So I don't think you really gain anything from it. I think you gain more from using that stir plate to make sure you have enough healthy yeast before you start, pitching enough healthy yeast, monitoring your temperature, things like that. You'll get the best beer possible. Have any opinion on this stir plate idea?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you're going to get a faster fermentation. It's going to finish a little bit lower than it would under natural circumstances. I don't think that CO2 entrained in the beer during fermentation is a real issue or risk to the beer. I mean, there are brewers that go to full carbonation in their lagering tanks and with no ill effects. So I think I'm not sure that this is a real risk for you. Certainly, rousing the yeast helps when your fermentation is lagging or stuck. But part of that is bringing air back into it, and not necessarily CO2 toxicity or anything. So yeah, I think, really where you need to make sure you don't have CO2 is in your yeast and in your yeast culture. And if you're propagating yeast, I think using a stir plate is a great way to do it, because you don't want that CO2 sitting in there while you're trying to grow yeast.
Mm-hmm. Adam asks in the chat, if you could go back and start over as a pro brewer with your own dream brewery and not factoring in market demands, what size brewery would you have? Brew house and tap room size. What would you brew? I'd brew beer. What size? I mean, not factoring in market demands is where the question kind of falls apart for me, because if I'm not factoring market demands, I would, just maybe home brew or I'd brew, 1,000 barrels at a time just so everybody could have free beer. That's what I'd do. If I won the lottery, I've said this multiple times, if I won the lottery, I would open a brewery tap room, and the beers would be the cheapest I could legally sell it for. In California, you have to sell it for the price that it costs you plus a certain amount. If I didn't have to do that, I would just give away free beer to everybody. I'm just like, free beer tap room. Just come on in, hang out, have some free beer. But I think you have to factor in market demands. I would probably set something up. If I had to do it over, I would set up a smaller place, maybe as many as, 100 seats. And I would have like a 10 barrel probably with some double and triple fermenters, maybe a 10 barrel with, if it got busy, room to add in, separate mash, lauter, pre-run and whirlpool and all that. So you can just quickly turn out multiple batches in a day. That's what I would do. How about you, Mitch?
I think I'd probably fall in that same range of size. 10 barrel brew house sounds really good. I would have a music venue, or at least a good stage and a PA system in the tap room. It's really nice to think about just brewing beers that I want to drink. Mm-hmm. But I've never approached brewing that way. But it's fun to think about, and I know brewers that have done it. And
it's this thing called home brewing.
Yes,
I don't know if you're
right.
familiar with it. Yeah. I could teach you.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I wouldn't sell it outside the tap room at all. It would just be, there'd be beer to go, but I wouldn't worry about distribution in the slightest.
I would run away from distribution as soon as I could if this was something that could work.
Yeah, zero distribution. Yeah, that's the key. That's the key to happiness. Zero distribution. Whatever it takes to not have any distribution of beer, that's what you want to do. You want to, the smallest building or the biggest or whatever it would take. That's what you're looking for. All right. One last quick break, and we'll wrap up with your questions right after this.
Back to the beer guys that make other beer guys look like wine guys. Brew strong.
All right, we're back. Having a fun time talking about all sorts of things based off of all your interesting questions. You guys never disappoint. Let's see here. Jeff asked, esteemed experts. Did you know you're an esteemed expert? You are.
Oh, that's very nice.
Yeah. I have recently moved to the beautiful land of Costa Rica. However, it's a veritable barren wasteland of beer. But that said, my aim is to go native. I have recently discovered Carao, I don't know, Cassia grandis, available at the Saturday market. It's similar to honey in viscosity with notes of chocolate and cherry. Minor side note, it is also referred to as stinking toe because of its pungent aroma. Although I think there's a hop called stinking toe.
There should be.
Yes. Although its medicinal properties are well documented, a search of forums, AHA, Northern Brewer, and the like, have yielded nothing on the topic. I'm considering it as an adjunct or creating something that resembles mead. Do you have any experience or insight into the particular ingredient and how to best harness its stinking power in the name of booze? Best, Jeff.
What a great question.
Yeah, my thought is, it has medicinal properties. You just need to be aware of the levels of safety on that, because some of these things that have medicinal properties, if you overdo it, could be harmful. So you just want to be careful about that. The stinking toe thing, you never know how it's going to turn out once it's fermented. Once it's boiled and fermented, you boil it, you ferment it, you drive off a lot of the volatiles, and the yeast can transform it into something else. Maybe great. It may go with certain hops. I mean, maybe quite nice. People associate certain hops with cat piss. And if people enjoy that, they could enjoy a stinking toe beer. I'm just saying. So I'd be careful on that. I'd, check to see what the points per gallon gravity you're going to get out of this, so you have some idea. Just throwing it in and see how much sugar there is. Try to figure out how fermentable it is. Maybe do some small scale tests just with that and some water. Boil some, ferment it out with a clean, like a 001 yeast, 1056 US05 yeast, and see what it tastes like, see what it smells like, and kind of match up your other ingredients to go with that. Sounds fascinating. Chocolate, notes of chocolate and cherry, similar to honey.
Yeah, I've never heard of this this ingredient. It sounds fascinating in a lot of different levels. I think brewing a beer with it, I would do that before I brewed something like a mead, just because you have the boiling process, you have other ingredients, you have, things that if it does retain its stinking toe character in an unpleasant way, at least you've got some other flavors to balance it out. And that would be after you do water trials, that'd be a good first test for it.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's always alcohol, so you still drink it.
Yep.
Stinking toe beer. Hey, next when this comes for hop naming, I'm ready to call something stinking toe.
I think that's great. I think I'll get with our marketing people and get that registered right now.
There you go. Yeah. It's a winner.
Wow.
I guarantee you, everybody would want to try it once.
Yep.
And then they probably wouldn't. They would think it stunk too much of toe, and regardless of what it smelled like. The names have a lot of impact on.
Yeah, they do.
On the success of beers. All right, that's our show for today. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you very much, Mitch Steele.
Thank you,
our honored guest, to join me. It's a lot of fun. If you enjoyed this, please make sure to reach out to our sponsors, Blickman Engineering. You can find them at blickmanengineering.com. Email John Blickman at feedback@blickmanengineering.com, and tell him how much you appreciate the show that we do, since he's paying for it, and shouldn't have cost you a penny. So enjoy. And our good friends at Brew Chatter up in Reno, where they're just great guys, a lot of fun to visit. Even if you don't brew, it'd be worth stopping in, saying hello, and having a pint with them. So until then, everybody, brew strong.